Garbage like you doesn't belong in a house of God, let alone a house of justice." Those were the words that would ignite a firestorm. A blaze so catastrophic it would incinerate the life and career of Officer Frank Miller in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. If you believe that no one, especially those in power, is above the law, then prove it. Stop what you're doing, smash that like button, and type "Justice Now" in the comments below. Let's see how many of us demand accountability. The story begins on a brutally cold Tuesday morning in November. Judge Eleanor Vance, cloaked in the anonymity of her civilian attire, a simple, elegant wool coat, ascended the grand granite steps of the Harrison P. Sterling Federal Courthouse. A heavy, worn leather briefcase, filled with the lives and futures of a dozen people, was held firmly in her gloved hand. The 8:30 a.m. sun was a weak, watery disk in the gray sky, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to claw at the monolithic columns flanking the entrance. For 20 years, this had been her ritual, a solemn pilgrimage to the seat of power she now commanded. Within that briefcase lay judicial orders bearing the weight of federal authority, complex case files she had spent the entire weekend dissecting, and administrative documents stamped with her official, unassailable seal. But Officer Frank Miller saw none of that. His vision was clouded by a thick, suffocating fog of prejudice, a poison he'd been mainlining for all 15 years of his stalled career. "Well, look what the damn cat dragged in," he muttered, his voice a low growl. He detached himself from the shadow of a massive concrete pillar, a predator emerging from its blind. At 6'3" and a solid 250 pounds of muscle and resentment, Miller had long ago learned that his physical presence was his most effective tool. Intimidation was cleaner, faster, and far more satisfying than the tedious paperwork of actual police work. He was a hammer, and to him, everyone who didn't look like him was a nail. "Another stray, thinking she can just wander onto federal property," he sneered, his words curling in the frigid air. He planted his massive frame directly in Eleanor's path, a human roadblock of pure contempt. His eyes, small and hard like chips of flint, weren't curious about her professional briefcase. They were accusatory. "This ain't the welfare office, lady. You lost, or are you just here to start trouble?" Eleanor halted. Her expression remained a mask of professional calm, but beneath it her senses screamed. She had navigated the treacherous waters of courtrooms for over 3 decades, facing down murderers and mob bosses. But this was a different kind of monster. This was raw, systemic hatred wearing a badge and a gun, and she felt the primal danger of it in her bones. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice even and polite, a stark contrast to his jagged rasp. "I'm here for work. If you need to see my identification, I'd be happy to—" "Work?" Miller's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound, like gravel being ground under a steel-toed boot. "Lady, the only work your kind has in this building lands you in a holding cell. This is a federal courthouse, not a damn soup kitchen. Now turn around and get lost before you make a problem for both of us." His voice was saturated with the unearned authority of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged, and never once faced the consequences of his own venom. As if summoned by the scent of conflict, 2 other officers, Reynolds and Diaz, materialized from the periphery. They were Miller's acolytes, vultures drawn to the promise of a fresh kill. "Got another one who thinks she runs the place, Frank?" Reynolds called out, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was already pulling out his phone, ready to record the humiliation for their private group chat. "They just never learn, do they?" Miller's eyes glinted with a cold, triumphant fire. This was his stage, and he had found his perfect victim. "Work," he repeated, savoring the word like a piece of rotten fruit. Let me guess. You're a high-powered lawyer? A federal judge, maybe? Or are you the damn Attorney General?" The sarcasm was a blunt instrument. That's what they all say when they get caught sniffing around where they don't belong. Eleanor felt the crushing weight of it all. The years of fighting twice as hard, of being twice as good, just to be seen as equal. But her composure was a fortress built over a lifetime of such assaults. "Officer, I don't have time for this. I simply need to get to my chambers. If you would just examine my credentials—" "The only credentials you're getting today are an arrest record," Miller snarled, closing the distance between them until she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "And you're about to earn it." What happened next was not just an assault. It was an act of sacrilege against the very temple of justice. It was captured by no fewer than 4 high-definition security cameras, a permanent, digital testament to the moment Officer Frank Miller committed career suicide. His open palm, thick and calloused, cracked across Eleanor's face with a sound that echoed off the cold granite. The force of the blow was so brutal it snapped her head to the side, sending a shockwave of pain through her jaw. The expensive briefcase, filled with the machinery of federal law, flew from her grasp. Judicial orders and signed legal documents fluttered down the steps like dead leaves, a paper trail marking the path to his own damnation. The sickening smack of the impact reverberated, a sound that would soon haunt his every waking moment and poison his dreams. Before she could even register the pain, Miller's massive hand was around her throat. His fingers, like thick sausages of muscle, dug into her flesh as he slammed her backward against the unforgiving courthouse wall. 20 feet above their heads, etched into the bronze facade, were the words, "The Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance, presiding." But Miller, blinded by the white-hot rage of his own bigotry, was completely oblivious to the staggering, cosmic irony. "Garbage like you has no business in a house of justice," he growled, his face a contorted mask of hatred just inches from hers. Spittle flew from his lips, a testament to his raw, unfiltered venom. "It's time you learned some goddamn respect for the law." The cold, cruel bite of metal cuffs dug into Eleanor's wrists as he wrenched her arms behind her back with a violent, unnecessary force. The other officers, Reynolds and Diaz, circled like hyenas, their phones held high, documenting what they believed was just another Tuesday morning power trip. They had no earthly idea they were creating state's evidence in the arrest of a sitting federal judge, gleefully filming the immolation of their own careers. "Another entitled one, thinks she can just walk into any building she wants," Diaz laughed, contemptuously kicking at the scattered legal documents. "Look at all this fake crap. They're getting real creative with these scams, I'll give them that." Eleanor's jaw throbbed with a fiery ache, but her mind was a razor-sharp instrument of law. She was 15 feet from her own courtroom, being brutalized by men who would soon discover that she held their professional destinies in the palm of her hand. The irony was a suffocating, bitter pill. But Frank Miller was about to receive a masterclass in the universe's cruel sense of humor. As he shoved her up the courthouse steps, a trophy of his morning's conquest, Eleanor was not just a victim. She was a judge, taking mental notes, cataloging every sneering face, every callous laugh, every single person who was about to be enrolled in her seminar on accountability. Inside the courthouse, Miller was high on his own power. The familiar rush of adrenaline that came with a righteous arrest surged through him. He was a conquering hero. Every eye was on him. Every hushed whisper was about his latest display of dominance. Security guards gave him approving nods. Court clerks scurried out of his way with a deference that fed his ego. This was his kingdom, and he had just violently reminded everyone who was king. "Got another one for the books, Sergeant Peterson," Miller announced to the desk sergeant, his chest puffed out with a peacock's pride. The adrenaline was a drug, and he felt invincible. Attempted breach of security, resisting arrest, and felony assault on a police officer. Sergeant Peterson, a man whose spirit had been ground to dust by 20 years behind that desk, barely glanced up. Miller's arrests were a dime a dozen. Same script, different character. "What's the story on this one, Frank?" Subject was casing the entrance, Miller began, his voice taking on the practiced, authoritative cadence he used for official reports. The lies flowed from him as easily as breath, each one a brick in the wall of his fabricated narrative. Carrying what looked like a briefcase full of forged legal documents, claimed she had official business here. When I tried to verify, she got hostile, then violent. Over 15 years, Miller had become an artist of the official lie, a master of omission and emphasis. In the sterile, cold holding area, Eleanor sat on a hard metal bench. Her professional clothes were now wrinkled and stained from Miller's assault. The handcuffs were cinched so tight, her fingers were turning a dusky shade of purple. But she had endured worse. As a young prosecutor in the trenches, she had faced down threats that would make Miller's bullying seem like child's play. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal strategy, cataloging every shattered protocol, every violated constitutional right. She mentally ticked off the Supreme Court precedents that now applied directly to her. Terry v. Ohio on reasonable suspicion, which Miller had none of. Miranda v. Arizona on her right to remain silent, a right she had been given no chance to exercise. Brady v. Maryland on the prosecution's duty to preserve evidence that was currently being recorded by Miller's own cronies. As a federal judge with 2 decades of experience, she had presided over thousands of cases, many involving police misconduct. She had sentenced men to die, listened to the most heartbreaking testimonies, and witnessed the entire spectrum of human depravity. But she had never, not once, experienced the system from this side of the bars. She had never felt the cold, dehumanizing grind of being processed like cattle. She had never sat in a cell, tasting the metallic tang of fear and rage, wondering if the scales of justice would tip toward truth, or if corruption would once again carry the day. The sheer absurdity of it all was overwhelming. Miller had assaulted a federal judge less than a stone's throw from her own chambers. He had desecrated legal documents she had personally written and signed. He had placed handcuffs on the one woman who possessed the constitutional authority to strip him of his freedom for the rest of his natural life. Her confiscated phone contained the direct numbers for the head of the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the United States Attorney General. Her briefcase, now sitting in an evidence bag, was filled with sensitive judicial materials that were, in themselves, irrefutable proof of her identity. But the most delicious irony of all was yet to come. Frank Miller was about to commit felony perjury in front of the one person in the entire world who had both the power and the encyclopedic knowledge to utterly destroy him with a single, devastating revelation. If you believe that no one should ever have to endure this kind of discrimination, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's create a global map of people who stand for justice. Frank's got a live one today, Officer Reynolds announced to the small crowd of law enforcement officers that had gathered near the booking desk, replaying the video on his phone for their entertainment. This one was a real piece of work, claimed she was a judge or something, even had a briefcase full of fake papers to sell the story. Officer Diaz laughed, a high-pitched, cruel sound. They watch too many movies. They think if they dress up and use big words, we're supposed to just roll out the red carpet. That's not how the real world works, sweetheart. The casual, open racism of their banter was sickening. Years of operating without consequences had made them bold, comfortable spewing their prejudice in the open, confident that the blue wall of silence would always protect them. "So what's the usual play here?" asked a rookie officer, his eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Open and shut," Miller replied, his confidence absolute. "The judge will see right through her act. These types always get the max sentence. They waste the court's time with their bullshit stories and false accusations of racism. The system doesn't like being disrespected. Miller had absolutely no idea that the system he so confidently referred to was, at that very moment, sitting on a cold metal bench just 20 feet away. He had no clue that his victim was the final arbiter of his entire professional existence, the gatekeeper for every warrant he sought and every testimony he gave. As the booking process dragged on, Eleanor remained perfectly still, a picture of calm defiance. But a closer look would have revealed the faintest hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. She was taking notes, not on paper, but in the indelible ink of her memory. Every name, every face, every lie. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he was proudly, stupidly, walking right into the center of her trap. In the courthouse's administrative wing, Miller began the meticulous process of constructing his official narrative. It was an art form he'd spent 15 years perfecting, the subtle alchemy of truth and fiction that transformed the messy, brutal reality of the street into the clean, sterile language of a legal report. The secret ingredients were unshakable confidence, a peppering of specific but unverifiable details, and a story that played directly into the pre-existing biases of prosecutors and judges. The system, he knew, was built to believe men like him over women like Eleanor Vance. "Let me walk you through the incident report," Miller said to Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. Walsh was a harried, middle-aged woman who saw her job as a conveyor belt. Her goal was to move cases from arrest to conviction as efficiently as possible. Miller's arrests were a godsend. They were always high-conviction, low-effort slam dunks. Subject approached the courthouse at approximately 08:30 hours, exhibiting suspicious behavior consistent with a potential security threat. Walsh nodded, her pen scratching across her notepad. She trusted Miller's instincts. His cases were always tidy, his testimony was always rock solid, and his arrests almost always ended in a plea bargain, keeping her caseload manageable. "What specific behaviors raised a red flag?" she asked, ready to transcribe the details that would form the bedrock of her prosecution. "Subject was dressed in a manner inconsistent with legitimate court business," Miller began, his voice shifting into the formal, professional tone he reserved for official statements. "Carrying an expensive briefcase that seemed out of place, given her overall appearance, suggests a possible theft, or that she was part of a larger fraud scheme." Each lie was a carefully placed stone, building a foundation of doubt about Eleanor's credibility, while reinforcing the very stereotypes that would make the system eager to believe him. "When I made my approach to investigate, the subject immediately became agitated and verbally abusive. She claimed to have official business, but refused to provide any identification when I requested it." Miller pulled out his small, worn notebook, flipping to a page where he had scribbled his fabricated account during the booking. Subject made several veiled threats, including statements like, "You'll regret this," and "You have no idea who I am." Classic diversionary tactics. We see it all the time with repeat offenders. The profound, suffocating irony of that last statement was almost poetic. Miller was 100% correct. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. "Did she attempt to flee or resist when you moved to detain her?" Walsh asked, ticking off the standard elements required for an assault and resisting arrest charge. "Absolutely," Miller said without a flicker of hesitation. "When I attempted to place her in protective custody for the safety of the public, she became physically violent. She swung at me, tried to kick me in the shins, and actively fought against being handcuffed. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to subdue her and neutralize the threat." Miller's performance was masterful. He was transforming his unprovoked, brutal assault into a heroic act of professional restraint. The lies had been told so many times, in so many different reports, that they felt more real to him than the truth. Meanwhile, in her cold cell, Eleanor was conducting her own legal analysis. As a former federal prosecutor who had specialized in civil rights cases, she knew Miller's playbook by heart. She could see exactly what he was building, lie by lie. But she also knew something Miller couldn't possibly comprehend. Every word he spoke under oath, every sentence he wrote in that report, was another nail in his own coffin. Perjury was a devastating felony, a charge that could send a law enforcement officer to prison for a very, very long time. Her phone calls from the booking desk had, of course, been monitored and recorded. But Miller's arrogance had made him sloppy. He had no idea that Eleanor's first call had not been to a lawyer, but to Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the most powerful jurist in the state. Her message was simple and urgent. Preserve every second of surveillance footage from every camera in and around the courthouse. Her second call was to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, where she formally requested a federal investigation into his conduct. The vast, unstoppable machinery of federal justice was already grinding into motion, but Miller was so blinded by his small, tactical victory that he was completely oblivious to the strategic annihilation that was heading his way. "What about the documents in the briefcase?" Walsh asked, looking at the evidence photos. "Clearly forgeries," Miller replied instantly. "High quality, I'll give her that. Legal briefs, judicial memos, case files, stuff no ordinary citizen would ever have. We think she was prepping for a major identity theft scam, maybe targeting judges or other court personnel." The documents were, of course, utterly authentic. Most of them bore her signature and official judicial seal. But Miller's prejudice was a filter that rendered truth invisible. "This seems like a straightforward case," Walsh concluded, snapping her folder shut with an air of finality. "Trespassing, assault on an officer, resisting arrest, attempted fraud. Her bizarre claims about being a judge are just the desperate ramblings of a cornered criminal." Miller allowed himself a small, grim smile. Another case closed. Another win. Another potent reminder that the system worked just as it was designed to. People either knew their place, or they were taught it the hard way. He had no idea that within a few short hours, he was about to learn exactly where his place was in the grand, unforgiving hierarchy of justice. The temporary courtroom was buzzing with the typical morning chaos of lawyers, defendants, and staff. Judge Robert Parker, a thin, sallow man in his late 60s, was filling in for the mysteriously absent Judge Vance. He ran his courtroom with the brusque efficiency of a man who viewed justice as an assembly line. He'd been informed that Judge Vance was dealing with a personal emergency, but he had no clue that the emergency was currently sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. "Case number 2025 CR 91228, the clerk droned. "The State versus Jane Doe." The use of Jane Doe was another of Miller's calculated insults. By listing her as an unknown, he further stripped her of her identity, reinforcing his narrative that she was a nameless, faceless nobody. Officer Frank Miller took the witness stand with the supreme, unshakable confidence of a man who had told his story 100 times and never been doubted. His uniform was starched to perfection, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his posture projected an aura of unimpeachable authority. He knew that in a courtroom, perception was reality. A confident cop with a good story could defeat almost any defense, especially when the defendant was a black woman the system was already predisposed to disbelieve. "Officer Miller," Ada Walsh began, her voice dripping with deference, "please describe for the court the events leading to the defendant's arrest." Miller cleared his throat, settled into the chair, and began his performance. Every gesture, every pause, every word was meticulously calculated to build his credibility and demolish Eleanor's. "Your Honor, at approximately under 8:30 this morning, while conducting my standard security patrol, I observed the defendant engaged in suspicious behavior near the main entrance, consistent with an individual planning an unauthorized entry. From the defendant's chair, Eleanor sat as still as a statue, her handcuffed hands resting in her lap. The deep purple bruise on her cheek was a stark, visible testament to his violence, but his narrative was already working to reframe that evidence, to twist it into a symbol of her aggression, not his. The defendant appeared to be conducting surveillance, Miller continued, his story gaining momentum. She was carrying legal documents that, upon initial inspection, appeared to be stolen or forged. Her behavior strongly suggested she was preparing to commit fraud or breach courthouse security. Judge Parker leaned forward, intrigued. Miller was a compelling storyteller. What specifically aroused your suspicion, officer? Several factors, Your Honor. First, her attire was inappropriate for someone with legitimate business here, yet she carried a briefcase that seemed entirely out of character with her socioeconomic profile. Second, she was loitering in a manner consistent with criminal reconnaissance. Each lie was a subtle poison, designed to infect the judge's perception of reality. Successful testimony wasn't about facts. It was about crafting a narrative that confirmed an audience's biases. When I approached her to investigate, Miller went on, his tone shifting to that of a patient professional forced to deal with an unhinged individual. The defendant immediately became hostile and belligerent. She refused to provide proper identification and began aggressively demanding to be let into the courthouse. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she listened to the grotesque distortion of the truth. Her polite requests were being twisted into aggressive demands. But she remained silent, a silent observer at the theater of the absurd, mentally recording every perjured word that would soon become an exhibit in his federal indictment. The defendant claimed to be a lawyer, then a judge, then insisted she worked in the building, Miller added, his voice laced with contempt. It's a classic playbook we see from career criminals trying to talk their way out of trouble. In the gallery, Reynolds and Diaz exchanged a knowing smirk. They'd seen this show before. The faces changed, but the script was always the same. The system always believed cops over criminals. What was the defendant's demeanor during this interaction? Walsh asked, teeing up the assault charge. Increasingly agitated and threatening, Your Honor. She kept saying I would regret stopping her, that I didn't know who I was messing with. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation by explaining our security protocols, she became physically violent. Miller paused, letting the dramatic tension hang in the air. That's when she tried to force her way past me into the building. I was forced to use the appropriate level of force to prevent a security breach. The lie was so audacious, so breathtakingly disconnected from reality, that Eleanor felt a flicker of perverse admiration for his sheer nerve. But she also knew that every syllable was being captured by the court stenographer, creating a permanent, legally binding record of his self-immolation. Frank Miller had no idea that his confident testimony was just him digging his own grave, deeper and deeper, with every lie. Miller was in his element now, his fabricated testimony flowing with the smooth, practiced ease of a seasoned actor. He knew exactly which buttons to push to make judges and juries see what he wanted them to see. Officer Miller, Ada Walsh continued, can you describe the specific nature of the defendant's physical aggression for the court? Absolutely, Your Honor. After her verbal threats failed, she escalated to physical violence. She swung her fist directly at my face, forcing me to raise my hand defensively to block the blow. Miller demonstrated the motion, a clean, professional-looking block. In reality, he was pantomiming the brutal backhand that had left the livid bruise on Eleanor's cheek, but his performance was so convincing it seemed plausible. When I attempted to secure her hands for everyone's safety, she began kicking violently at my legs and struggling with all her might. At that moment, I knew I was dealing with someone who posed a serious threat to the safety and security of this courthouse. Judge Parker nodded grimly, completely ensnared in Miller's web of lies. And what measures did you take to bring the situation under control? I utilized the minimum force necessary to subdue her aggression, Your Honor. I secured her hands in department-issued restraints and immediately radioed for backup to secure the area. The lies were becoming more elaborate, more confident. Miller had learned long ago that the key to effective testimony was absolute commitment to the narrative, no matter how far it strayed from the truth. I want to emphasize for the court, Miller added, leaning forward earnestly, that I exercised extreme restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A less experienced officer might have been forced to use far more significant force to control her violent behavior. Eleanor almost let a smile touch her lips. It was the classic police misconduct playbook, page for page. Step 1. Claim the victim was the aggressor. Step 2. Emphasize the officer's heroic restraint. Step 3. Suggest drug use without a shred of evidence. Step 4. Present naked brutality as professional policing. Officer Miller, Judge Parker interjected, in your professional opinion, what was the defendant's motivation? Miller's eyes gleamed. This was his favorite part, the moment he got to present his own bigotry as expert analysis. Your Honor, in my 15 years on the force, I've seen this pattern countless times. Certain individuals feel they are entitled to special treatment, that the rules don't apply to them. When confronted by legitimate authority, their first move is to cry racism or police brutality. His voice swelled with a righteous indignation he had perfected over years of testimony. Frankly, it's an insult to the real victims of discrimination. This defendant is attempting to weaponize legitimate social issues to evade responsibility for her own criminal actions. She knows that if she can make this about race, she might be able to manipulate the system. Several people in the gallery, courthouse regulars who knew and liked Miller, nodded in agreement. His narrative was comfortable, familiar. It confirmed what they already wanted to believe about crime and justice. Miller pulled out his phone, the one Reynolds had used to record the incident. I have partial video here, Your Honor. Unfortunately, my own body camera suffered a technical malfunction this morning. The lie was smooth as silk. A malfunctioning camera was always more believable than no camera at all. It allowed him to present a carefully edited snippet that supported his story while hiding the full truth. However, this footage clearly shows the defendant's combative state and my professional, measured response. Eleanor knew his body camera hadn't malfunctioned. She knew that every second of footage was automatically backed up to a secure county server. But Miller was clearly unaware of the digital tripwires he was blundering into. Officer Reynolds, Ada Walsh called. Can you corroborate Officer Miller's testimony? Reynolds stood tall, his expression a mask of solemn duty. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire event. Officer Miller acted with exemplary professionalism and restraint. Eleanor watched as the conspiracy of lies grew, each new perjury making Miller's eventual fall from grace that much more spectacular. Reynolds, who had been laughing and egging Miller on, was now presenting himself as a dispassionate, credible witness. The defendant was clearly attempting to bypass security. Her behavior was erratic and confrontational from the start. She seemed intent on forcing her way into the building through intimidation. And the assault on Officer Miller? Judge Parker asked. Your Honor, I saw it with my own eyes. She swung at his face and kicked at him when he tried to cuff her. Officer Miller showed incredible patience in the face of such unprovoked aggression. The sheer scope of the perjury was breathtaking. 3 sworn officers of the law were now on the record, under oath, telling a coordinated series of lies about their assault on a federal judge. They had twisted a criminal act into a heroic one, their victim into a dangerous felon. But Eleanor knew something they didn't. Every false word was being etched into the permanent legal record, creating a mountain of evidence for their federal prosecution for conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. "Officer Diaz," Walsh called, summoning the third member of the conspiracy to the stand. "What did you observe regarding the defendant's possession of fraudulent documents?" Diaz approached the stand with the same rehearsed confidence as his partners. "Your Honor, I can confirm everything my colleagues have testified to," he began. "But I want to focus on the evidence of premeditation. This wasn't a random outburst. It was a planned criminal act." Judge Parker's eyebrows shot up. A finding of premeditation could add years to a sentence. "The defendant was carrying a sophisticated collection of forged legal documents," Diaz continued, gesturing to the evidence table where the contents of Eleanor's briefcase were displayed. "Case files, judicial orders, administrative memos, materials that only authorized personnel should have." Eleanor felt a surge of grim amusement. Diaz was describing her own work product as a master forgery. He was so blinded by his own ignorance that he couldn't recognize authentic judicial materials sitting right in front of him. "In my professional opinion," Diaz declared, "the defendant was planning to impersonate a court official to commit some kind of large-scale fraud. The quality of these forgeries suggests a well-funded and organized criminal enterprise." "Officer Diaz," Judge Parker interjected, "what specifically about these documents made you suspect they were forgeries?" Diaz picked up one of Eleanor's authentic case files, holding it as if it were radioactive. "Your Honor, this document contains highly sensitive information about ongoing federal cases, confidential judicial notes, attorney-client privileged communications. No ordinary citizen would have access to this." The document he was holding was filled with her own handwritten notes from a case she'd presided over just last week. Her official judicial seal was embossed on the letterhead. But Diaz saw only what he expected to see. "Furthermore," he went on, "her reaction when confronted about these documents was consistent with guilt. She became evasive and refused to explain how she obtained them. Comment your country and your city. Let's see where in the world people are standing up for real justice tonight." The sophistication of this scheme, Diaz concluded with a flourish, suggests the defendant may be part of a larger criminal network targeting our judicial system. I urge the court to consider these broader implications when deciding on a sentence. Ada Walsh beamed. The testimony had been flawless. "Your Honor," she announced confidently, "the state believes the evidence clearly demonstrates a coordinated attack on the very foundations of our justice system. The defendant's desperate attempts to frame this as a civil rights issue are a calculated distraction from the gravity of her crimes." Miller permitted himself a moment of pure, unadulterated pride. This was how the system was supposed to work. "Officer Miller," Judge Parker said, "do you have anything to add before we hear from the defendant?" Miller couldn't resist a final victory lap. He stood slowly, his chest puffed out, a paragon of law and order. "Just this, Your Honor. Incidents like this are a reminder of why we need strong, decisive policing. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. I trust this court will send a clear message that attacks on law enforcement will not be tolerated." He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. He had just delivered his own eulogy. The trap was set. The lies were on the record. And Judge Eleanor Vance was about to spring it. "The state rests, Your Honor," Ada Walsh declared. As Miller stepped down from the stand, he caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a slow, deliberate wink. It was a gesture of absolute dominance, of total victory. It was the last moment of triumph he would ever experience. Judge Parker sighed, looking down at the defendant's table with the weary air of a man about to listen to a fairy tale. "The defendant may now make her statement, though I must caution you, the evidence presented against you is substantial." Eleanor Vance rose from her chair. The clink of her handcuffs was the only sound in the silent courtroom. Despite the ugly bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she projected an aura of such profound dignity that it sent a ripple of unease through the room. There was something different about her. Her posture was erect, her expression was calm, and when she spoke, her voice possessed an authority that seemed to command the very air. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her tone so measured and professional that Judge Parker looked up from his notes, his attention suddenly piqued. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these false allegations." Her diction was flawless, her bearing that of someone who belonged in a courtroom, but not in the defendant's chair. "First," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I would like to correct several glaring factual inaccuracies in Officer Miller's sworn testimony." Her eyes swept the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on Miller, Reynolds, and Diaz. "According to Officer Miller, I was trespassing. However, I was on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:32 a.m. She turned to address Judge Parker directly. "Your Honor is surely familiar with the Supreme Court's ruling in Hague v. CIO, which establishes that such sidewalks are traditional public forums where all citizens have a constitutional right to be." The court stenographer's fingers froze over her keys. This was not the rambling, emotional denial she had expected. The legal citation was perfect. The reasoning was sound. "Furthermore," Eleanor went on, "Officer Miller testified that I was carrying suspicious documents. I would like to examine that claim." She gestured with her cuffed hands toward the evidence table. "Those are in fact authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, signed judicial memoranda, and official administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate, professional access to." Judge Parker's expression was morphing from boredom to deep concern. "Professional access? And what exactly is your profession, Miss—" Eleanor allowed a small, knowing smile to touch her lips. It was a smile that sent the first icy tendril of fear snaking down Frank Miller's spine. "Vance, Dr. Eleanor Vance. And I believe we'll get to my professional background in due course, Your Honor, if I may continue?" The question was a formality. Her tone made it a command. "Officer Miller also testified that I became verbally aggressive. On that point, I will invoke my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. I will note, however, that any statements I may have made were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification." A young law clerk in the back of the room sat bolt upright. There was something hauntingly familiar about this woman's voice, her cadence, her effortless command of legal procedure. "Now, regarding Officer Miller's claim that his body camera malfunctioned," Eleanor continued, and now there was a core of steel in her voice that made the bailiffs shift nervously. "Your Honor, as you know, Federal Rule of Evidence 106 allows for the introduction of complete recordings when only a partial or misleading portion has been presented." Judge Parker was now leaning forward, his full attention captured. "I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's entire encounter exists and will be made available to this court through the proper channels." Miller's face was beginning to lose its color. His confident smirk was curdling into a mask of dawning horror. Something was going terribly, terribly wrong. "What evidence are you referring to?" Judge Parker asked, his voice now tight with apprehension. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. "Your Honor, this courthouse is blanketed by an extensive network of high-definition security cameras, all of which record to a centralized server with automatic, tamper-proof backup protocols." Miller felt his stomach plummet. In his arrogant rush to fabricate a narrative, he'd completely forgotten about the courthouse's own cameras. "Additionally," she continued with devastating precision, The county's IT protocol automatically backs up all officer body camera footage to a secure cloud server in real time. Any local malfunction is irrelevant. Her voice was now that of a law professor lecturing a failing student. I would like to formally request that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 08:30 and 09 hours, including all courthouse security footage, officer body camera backup files, and any recordings made by other law enforcement personnel at the scene. Ada Walsh leaped to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands. Eleanor turned to face the prosecutor. The look in her eyes made Walsh take an involuntary step back. Your Honor, pro se defendants have a fundamental right to present evidence under the Sixth Amendment. Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's affirmative duty to preserve and disclose all potentially exculpatory evidence. And Giglio v. United States requires the disclosure of any evidence that might impeach the credibility of a prosecution witness, particularly a police officer who may have committed perjury. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Ms. Vance, Judge Parker said, clearing his throat nervously, you have an unusually sophisticated understanding of constitutional law. Do you have formal legal training? Eleanor's smile widened, though it never reached her eyes. I have some familiarity with the judicial system, Your Honor. She moved toward the evidence table, gesturing to her scattered belongings. I'd also like to address Officer Miller's characterization of my presence here as suspicious. This, she said, pointing to a specific document, is my daily court calendar. It clearly shows I was scheduled to appear in this very building for legitimate judicial business at 9:00 a.m. Bailiff Henderson, a veteran who had worked in this courthouse for 20 years, suddenly went rigid. His face turned ashen as a flicker of horrifying recognition ignited in his brain. Officer Miller testified that I claimed to be someone important, Eleanor said. To be clear, I never made such a claim. I did, however, repeatedly attempt to show him my official identification, which he refused to even look at before he assaulted me. Miller was now openly sweating, his bravado crumbling into dust. Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice ringing with newfound power, I have in my possession, despite Officer Miller's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse. What kind of documentation? Judge Parker asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor reached carefully into her coat pocket. My official judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse, my building access card, programmed with my personal chamber's entry code. And, she paused, holding up a leather credential wallet. My federal judicial identification. Even from across the room, the golden eagle of the federal judicial seal was unmistakable. Bailiff Henderson shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure horror as he finally, truly recognized the woman he greeted every single morning, the woman whose courtroom he protected. Your Honor, Eleanor said quietly, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding. The color drained completely from Frank Miller's face. His hands began to shake. His entire life was flashing before his eyes. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested, her voice dripping with lethal calm, we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified. Judge Parker stared at the credential wallet, then at Eleanor's face, then at the bailiff, who was nodding grimly, confirming his worst nightmare. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he croaked, his voice hoarse. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot. As the courtroom erupted in chaos, Frank Miller felt the world dissolve beneath his feet. He had just arrested God, and Judgment Day was here. During the 15-minute recess, A shockwave of frantic whispers and panicked phone calls ripped through the courthouse. In a small holding room, Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling violently. "Judge Vance," he whispered, his voice choked with horror. "Oh my God, Judge Vance, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you. They brought you in and It's all right, Henderson," Eleanor said, her voice calm and steady. "You did nothing wrong, but I need you to do something for me now, something very important." "Anything, Your Honor, absolutely anything." Her gaze was like steel. "I need you to go to my chambers, quietly, and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim, and Henderson, bring my ceremonial gavel." He nodded and practically sprinted from the room. Moments later he returned, his face still pale, carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. With deliberate, practiced movements, Eleanor unzipped the bag. As she slipped the heavy black robes over her shoulders, a profound transformation occurred. She was no longer a victim. She was the embodiment of federal judicial power, an instrument of the Constitution. The weight of the robes was a familiar comfort, a mantle of authority she had worn for 2 decades. She opened the box and took out the ceremonial gavel, its polished wood warm in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words she had chosen at her appointment ceremony: "Justitia cecca est, sed omnia videt." Justice is blind, but she sees all. "Henderson," she said, her voice now resonant with power, "when we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me with full judicial protocol." "Yes, Your Honor. What shall the announcement be?" Eleanor straightened to her full height. The bruise on her cheek was no longer a mark of victimization. It was a battle scar, a symbol of the justice she was about to deliver. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance, presiding. In the courtroom, Miller was slumped in a chair, his face ashen, his career and freedom evaporating before his eyes. Reynolds and Diaz were huddled in a corner, their panic palpable. Ada Walsh was on her phone, her voice shrill as she tried to comprehend how her slam-dunk case had just exploded in her face. The gallery was now packed with courthouse staff, lawyers, and even other judges, all drawn by the scent of an unprecedented judicial event. Chief Judge Margaret Carter had taken a seat in the front row, her expression a thundercloud. The doors to the courtroom swung open. "All rise," Henderson's voice boomed with an authority that shook the room. "This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance, presiding." The words struck the courtroom like a bolt of lightning. Miller froze, his blood turning to ice. Ada Walsh's mouth fell open, her files scattering across the floor. Judge Parker, who had foolishly remained, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Eleanor Vance entered through the judge's private door. She moved with a slow, majestic grace, her black robes flowing behind her. She ascended the dais, took her seat in her chair, behind her bench, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes, cold and brilliant, swept the room before landing on the man who had assaulted her. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a tidal wave. "You may remain standing." Miller looked like he was about to collapse. "Judge Parker," she said, her tone crisp, "thank you for filling in. You are dismissed." Parker fled the room as if escaping a fire. "Officer Miller," she continued, her voice like chipping ice. "2 hours ago you testified under oath. Do you recall your testimony?" Miller could only manage a weak, pathetic nod. "Let me refresh your memory," she said, holding up a transcript. "You stated, and I quote, 'These types always get the max sentence.' Do you recall saying that, Officer Miller?" He was shaking violently now. "And you also testified, under oath, that people like me need to learn that, and I quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall imparting that piece of wisdom?" Diana picked up a tablet computer. "Officer Miller, some new evidence has come to my attention." She turned the screen towards the courtroom. "This is from Courthouse Security Camera 7. The video played, showing the entire unprovoked assault in crystal clear high definition. The courtroom gasped as they heard Miller's hateful words, watched his hand crack across her face, saw him slam her against the wall. "Scum like you has no business in a house of justice," his voice echoed, condemning him. "Now," Eleanor said, swiping to a new file, "let's examine your claim of a malfunctioning body camera. This is the backup footage from your own camera, automatically uploaded to the county's secure cloud server." The new video played, capturing Miller's own voice, raw and unfiltered. "Look at this uppity bitch. Thinks she can just walk into my courthouse. Time to teach her a lesson." The naked, vicious racism of his private thoughts filled the room, a sickening testament to his guilt. "Officer Reynolds, Officer Diaz," she called out. "You both testified that Officer Miller acted with exemplary professionalism. Would you care to amend your sworn testimony at this time?" They were already backing toward the exit, their faces pale with terror. "But there's more," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 9 months, I have been personally overseeing a joint FBI and Department of Justice investigation into a pattern of corruption, racial bias, and civil rights violations within your precinct." Miller's face went completely slack with shock. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty, gray mask of absolute horror. "This morning's incident was not random, Officer Miller. You have been a primary subject of that investigation for months. And today, you personally handed us the most perfect, undeniable, irrefutable evidence of felony civil rights violations a prosecutor could ever dream of." She lifted her ceremonial gavel. "Justitia caeca est, sed omnia videt." Justice is blind, but she sees all. Officer Miller, you said actions have consequences. You were correct. She stood, a towering figure of righteous fury. "Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence from your own mouth and your own camera, I find you guilty of felony assault. I find you guilty of assault on a federal officer. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law. And I find you guilty of felony perjury." With each charge, Miller seemed to shrink, crushed under the weight of his own crimes. "But this was never just about you, Officer Miller," she said, her voice now ringing with passion, addressing the packed gallery. "You are a symptom of a disease that has infected our justice system. For too long, we have allowed men like you to operate with impunity. For too long, we have told victims that their voices don't matter. That ends today. What happened here proves that no one is above the law." Miller finally broke, collapsing into his chair, his body racked with pathetic, gut-wrenching sobs. "I'm sorry," he wept. "I'm so sorry I didn't know." Judge Vance looked down at the shattered man, her expression unyielding. "Your apology comes years and countless victims too late, officer. Your remorse is born of capture, not conscience. In your final moments as a free man, I want you to think of every person you brutalized, every life you ruined. They all deserved the same justice I am delivering today." She raised the gavel high. "Today, I'm not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering it for every single person whose voice was silenced by a uniform and a lie." Her voice was a clarion call for a new era. "Officer Miller, you told me to know my place. My place is right here, ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge to destroy innocent lives." The gavel came down with the sound of thunder. Final, absolute. "Officer Frank Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Bailiffs, take this garbage out of my courtroom." 6 months later, the Harrison P. Sterling Federal Courthouse was officially renamed the Honorable Eleanor Vance Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque was installed by the entrance, commemorating the morning that justice, for a moment, was not blind, but saw everything with perfect, devastating clarity. The story of what happened that day became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in every precinct in the country. It was a reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. The support you've shown in the comments proves that people everywhere are hungry for accountability. If you believe courage can change the world, share this video with everyone you know. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because the fight for justice is far from over, and you won't want to miss what comes next.